Fall of 2019, a man named Gus Bauer drove 62 miles to the regional packing plant outside Kerrville with 11 yearling lambs in a stock trailer and the buyer on the dock, a young grader named Reese, looked at them for about 4 seconds and turned them away. He did not weigh them. He said the frames were wrong. The fat was wrong. The whole proposition was a boutique liability. And he handed Gus a printed sheet of carcass specifications, the way a man hands back a permit application that was never going to be approved. Gus folded the sheet into his shirt pocket, backed the trailer down the ramp, and drove the lambs home. 4 years later, in the spring of 2023, a chef in Houston who had eaten Gus Bauer's cold-smoked mutton ham at a tasting in Austin placed a single standing order, and the number on that order for one small operation that the packing plant would not take at any price was the kind of number that makes a man sit down at his own kitchen table and read it twice. This is the story of the span between those 2 days, and of the difference between what a grading sheet measures and what a hungry person at a good table is actually willing to pay for. Stay with me, because the heart of it is a thing you can hold in your hands and taste. And most of us were taught to call it worthless. Let me tell you how a slaughterhouse refusal became the best thing that ever happened to one piece of ground in the hill country, and how an old smokehouse most people would have torn down turned out to be the only part of the farm the market could not replace. Gus Bauer was 63 that fall, and he was known in Kerr County for 2 things. He was the quietest man at any sale barn he ever set foot in, and he kept a flock of sheep that nobody else in 3 counties would have bothered to keep. They were Navajo Churro, a breed his grandfather had carried into the Texas hills in cloth-tied bundles of fleece, and a single breeding ram nobody local wanted, and they did not look like money. They were lean and long-legged and slow to finish, with coarse double coats and horns on some of the rams that curled like questions. Set beside the heavy, square, fast-gaining commercial lambs that filled the pens at the sale barn, they looked like a mistake, like something out of a museum. The buyers measured lambs by how fast they put on fat and how cleanly they fit a carcass grid built for a particular kind of cut, a grid printed on a laminated card that hung at the receiving dock and admitted of no argument. By that measure, the churro flock was a failure, and Gus had heard it said in those words and others for 40 years. Hobby, folk wisdom. A pretty flock for a man who did not need the money, which Gus most certainly did. He had not argued any of it. He had gone home and kept the flock because his grandfather had kept it, and because the old man had left him something the buyers never asked to see and never would have known to value if they had. He had left a journal. It was a water-stained leather notebook, the kind a man buys once and uses for the rest of his life, and it was filled, front to back, with 2 generations of handwriting. His grandfather's in a careful slanting hand, and his father's beneath it in pencil. It recorded which ewes threw twins on poor grass, and which lambs walked the farthest from the water in a dry July without losing weight. And it recorded, in patient detail, how to take an animal the commodity market did not want and turn it into something a particular kind of buyer would cross a state to find. There were pages on which ram to keep and which to cut, marked by the depth of a winter coat and the set of a hoof on rock. There were pages on the smokehouse fire, how green wood smolders cool and dry wood burns hot, and why you wanted the first and never the second. There were prices, too, decades of them, what a cured leg had brought in 1958 and 1971 and 1994, always more than a live lamb, always to a buyer who came, looking rather than one you chased. The journal was the inheritance. The deed to the ground was just the place the inheritance lived. Reese, the grader who turned Gus away that day, was not a bad man, and it matters to say so plainly. He was 28. He had a degree in animal science from a good program, and he believed, with the clean confidence of a person whose model has never once failed in front of him, that the carcass grid measured everything that mattered about a lamb. He had been taught that uniformity was efficiency, and efficiency was survival, and nothing in his training had given him a reason to doubt it. When he called the churro flock a boutique liability, he was not insulting Gus. He was describing, accurately, what those lambs were worth inside the only system he had ever been shown. The trouble was that the system measured weight and grade and turn, and it had no column at all for the thing Gus Bauer actually sold. Let me tell you about that thing, because it is the center of everything that follows. When Gus brought those 11 lambs home that fall, he did not sulk, and he did not call the extension office. He did what his grandfather's journal told him to do. With animals the grid rejected, he took the older ones, the yearlings and a few cull ewes carrying good back fat, and he made mutton ham, not the wet, pink, injected ham of a grocery cooler, a dry-cured cold-smoked leg, salted by hand, hung in the dark, and turned slowly into something, with the density of cured beef, and a flavor the commodity world had simply forgotten existed. Here is the mechanism, plainly, because the niche of this story is not nostalgia, but how a real thing actually works. Curing is the controlled removal of water. Salt, rubbed into the muscle and packed against it for a set number of days per pound, pulls moisture out of the meat and makes the inside of it a place bacteria cannot easily live. That is the first wall. The second wall is cold smoke, which is smoke generated far enough from the meat that it never cooks it, drifting up through a hung leg over many days, laying down compounds that slow spoilage further and carry flavor deep into the fiber. The third wall is time itself, weeks and then months in a cool, dark room, with steady air during which the leg loses a third of its weight in water and concentrates everything that is left: salt, smoke, and time. 3 walls against rot, built by men who never heard the word refrigeration, and the meat that comes out the far side of those 3 walls is not preserved leftovers. It is the most valuable form that animal will ever take. The churro lambs, it turned out, were bred for exactly this. Their lean, slow-finishing frames, the very thing the grid marked down, produced a firm, dark muscle that cured beautifully, where a fast, fat commercial lamb would have gone soft and rancid. A fat lamb carries its weight in soft fat that turns in the cure, that goes greasy, and then sour as the months pass, because there is too much water bound up in it for the salt to ever fully win. A lean churro carries its weight in dense red muscle, laced with hard, clean fat that sets wax in the cold smoke, and only deepens with age. The coarse animal the buyer would not weigh was the perfect animal for the smokehouse. Gus's grandfather had not kept the breed out of stubbornness. He had kept it because he knew what it was for. The salting was not a feeling. It was a measured thing, the way the journal recorded it. Gus weighed each leg before he started, and he salted it at a rate fixed to that weight, packing coarse salt against the meat and turning it on a schedule, so many days per pound, the leg sitting on a slatted board with a stone on top to press it down. He had taught Nell to read the leg with her thumb, to feel the moment. The muscle firmed from raw softness into something that pushed back, the moment the water had come far enough out that the cure had taken hold all the way to the bone. Pushed too fast, and the outside cured, while the inside stayed wet and spoiled in secret. Wait too long in the salt, and the meat went hard and oversalted past saving. The window was narrow, and the only instrument for finding it was a thumb that had pressed 10,000 legs, which was exactly the kind of instrument a carcass grid could not contain. The smokehouse was a squat limestone building behind the barn, older than the barn, black inside with a century of soot, and most people who saw it assumed it was abandoned. To the appraiser who had once valued the place, it was a derelict outbuilding worth nothing. To Gus, it was the only structure on the property that could not be bought at a farm supply store, the one piece of the operation that held knowledge instead of just holding hay. He had a granddaughter named Nell. She was 24 that fall, a freshly framed degree in agricultural business, and she had come back to the hill country with a head full of spreadsheets and a quiet conviction that her grandfather was a sweet, stubborn old man slowly going broke. She loved him. She was also embarrassed by him, by the unweighed lambs in the sooty stone shed, and the refusal to do the one thing every advisor told them to do, which was to either get big or get out. When she heard about the rejection at the plant, she did the math the way she had been taught, and the math said, sell the flock, lust the xis, and stop bleeding money on a breed the market had clearly rejected. She said as much gently at the kitchen table. Gus listened, and then he asked her to help him salt a leg, and she did, because she loved him and because she did not yet have a better idea. Down the road was a man named Dale, and Dale matters to this story as much as anyone. He was Gus's age. They had ridden the same school bus, and Dale had made the opposite choice with his life. Where Gus kept a small flock of an old breed, Dale had gone all in on commercial lambs and gone into debt to do it right. In 2018, he had borrowed $180,000 against his land to build a modern feeding setup and buy a fast-gaining commercial. Flock, 340 head, the kind the buyers loved. Square and heavy and uniform. He fed them, purchased grain at the going rate, and ran them on irrigated pasture that drank water out of a well in a creek. Dale was not foolish. He had done exactly what the experts at every meeting had told him to do. And for 2 years, it looked like the smartest bet in the county. His lambs graded high. His checks from the plant were real, $8,000 and $9,000 at a time, and he framed the first one and hung it in the kitchen. When he leaned on Gus's fence in those years, he did it kindly, but he did it the way a man looks at a relative who refuses to see a doctor. He told Gus once, in the easy way of a man who thinks he is helping, that the churro flock was a hobby with a fence around it, that there was no shame in admitting the day of the small, odd operation was over. Gus had looked at the lambs a while and then said only that the day was not over for anything that could live on what the hills gave. Dale had laughed, not unkindly, and let it go. He had a new sprayer coming, and a contract with the plant and a banker who returned his calls within the hour. He did not see why he would ever need to win that argument. That winter Nell kept helping in the smokehouse, mostly to keep an eye on her grandfather, and somewhere in the salting and the hanging and the long waiting, she started asking questions she had not meant to ask. Why this breed and not a faster one? Why cold smoke and not hot? Why hang it for 4 months when you could sell a live lamb in 5? Gus answered each question with 1 or 2 sentences and then went back to work. And the journal answered the rest, page by page, in the careful slanting hand of a man who had been dead for 30 years. The first time her doubt cracked, she did not tell anyone. It was a January morning, the smokehouse cold enough that her breath showed, and she took down a leg that had hung since October and shaved a sliver off the face the way Gus had shown her. She had eaten it before and thought it fine. The way you think your grandfather's cooking is fine. This time she had spent 3 months learning what went into it, and she tasted the smoke and the salt and the long dark patience all at once. And she stood there in the cold with a thin curl of dark meat on her tongue and understood that it was not fine. It was extraordinary in the plain sense of the word, a thing that did not exist anywhere. A spreadsheet could find it. She put the leg back on its hook and said nothing. But she stopped that morning, doing the math that ended in sell the flock. Nell read the journal at night after that. She had been trained to trust numbers, and she began to notice that the journal was full of numbers too, just numbers about a different thing. Days per pound of salt, weight lost in the cure, always close to a third. The temperature of the smokehouse on a January morning, recorded for 60 years of January mornings. It was a ledger. It was just a ledger of something her professors had never mentioned, and the longer she read it, the more it looked less like an old man's diary, and more like the most rigorous document she had ever held. Now, I want to be fair to the world Reese came from, because this is not a story about a wicked young man and a wise old one. It is a story about two kinds of knowing. Reese's kind was wide and shallow and confident, built to handle 10,000 animals it would never meet, and inside its own borders it worked. It moved more protein to more people more cheaply than any system in human history. Gus's kind was narrow and deep and patient, built around one flock on one piece of limestone ground that he had watched for 40 years. It could not scale, and it did not want to. The two kinds of knowing do not usually collide, because they do not usually compete for the same thing. The churro lambs were the rare place where they did. And the question the story had to answer was which kind of knowing would prove sounder when the weather and the market stopped being kind. That spring Nell drove a wrapped mutton ham to Austin without telling her grandfather because she had heard that a small grocer there sold to restaurants, and she was tired of watching good work go nowhere. The shop was narrow and smelled of cheese and cured pork, and the man behind the counter, an older fellow with a long knife, and no patience for small talk, almost waved her off when she said it was lamb. People had brought him lamb before. Then he cut a thin slice, held it to the window light so it went translucent at the edge, and ate it slowly. And his face changed in a way he did not bother to hide. He cut a second slice and ate that one too. Then he asked her a single question. He asked how many legs her grandfather could make in a year. Not what it cost, not how it graded, how many. Nell, who had spent 4 years learning to lead with price, did not have an answer, and she drove home, understanding for the first time that she had been selling the wrong thing her whole life, or rather that her grandfather had been making the right thing, and no one had ever asked him the right question. There was a county producers meeting that next spring in 2021 in a fluorescent lit room behind the feed store, and Reese was there to present the new carcass standards to the men who sold to his plant. He was good at it, clear and patient, and when an older man asked, half joking, what a fellow ought to do with a flock the plant would not take, Reese found Gus in the back row, without quite meaning to, and answered the room. He said kindly that there would always be a few boutique operations, chasing a niche that could not feed anybody, and that the honest advice was to either meet the grid or accept that you were running a hobby with a fence around it. He did not say Gus's name. He did not have to. The men nearby glanced at Gus, who sat with his hat on his knee and said nothing, and the word boutique landed in that room for the second time, in this story, in a register of public good faith that was somehow worse than the doc had been. Nell was beside him, and she felt her face go hot, and she was surprised to find that the heat was not embarrassment anymore. It was anger, and it was the first time she had ever been angry on the old method's behalf. That winter, the standing question, the one the grocer, and then the chef had both asked, began to change the shape of the work. Let me tell you what happened next, because this is where the patient path and the confident path began, quietly to switch places. The grocer's question reached a chef, and the chef came out to the farm. In the early summer of 2021, a serious woman named Ada, who ran a kitchen in Houston, that the right people drove a long way to eat at. She drove a plain rented sedan up the gravel, and she did not tour the pasture, and she did not ask about the grid. She went straight to the smokehouse as if she had been there before. Stood in the cool dark, with the hung legs over her head, and breathed in for a long time with her eyes closed. Gus stood by the door and let her. Then she took down one leg, asked for a knife, shaved a curl of dark meat off the cut face, and tasted it without salt or bread or comment. The silence in that smokehouse lasted long enough that Nell felt her own pulse in her ears. Ada opened her eyes and said she would take every leg Gus could make, that she would not haggle over the price, and that he should not change a single thing about how he made it. Then she asked, the way the grocer had, how many he could produce in a year, because she already knew that the answer was the only thing that could limit her. It was the summer the rain stopped. Let me tell you about the drought of 2022, because it is the structural fact that settled the argument. Neither man could settle by talking. It came on slowly and then all at once, the way droughts do in that country. By July, the county had gone 4 months without a real rain. The stock tanks were rings of cracked mud, and the price the purchased grain Dale's flock depended on had climbed by half, because half of Texas was buying it at once. The creeks that fed Dale's irrigated pasture ran thin and then ran dry. His well drew sand. His 340 commercial lambs, bred for fast gain on lush feed, did not know how to live on what the hills offered when the green was gone. And the grain to keep them was priced for a year nobody had planned for. To the bank, Dale's operation had been a model of efficiency. To the drought, it was a flock of animals that could not survive without inputs. The drought had just made impossible. Gus's churro flock, the museum piece, the boutique liability, walked farther for water and ate the rough, dry browse the hills still carried. The cedar and the dropside and the scrub, the commercial lambs would not touch, because 40 generations of them had been selected on exactly this ground to do exactly this thing. The Journal had a word for it, written by his grandfather in 1951. It said they hunt their living. They did not gain fast. In a wet year, that was their flaw. In the dry year of 2022, it was the only thing that mattered. Because a slow lamb that lives is worth infinitely more than a fast lamb that dies. The arithmetic of that summer was brutal and plain. Across Kerr County, the commercial flocks came off the dry pastures light and stressed, and feeder lamb prices fell by roughly a third, as everyone dumped animals into the same flooded market at the same time. Dale sold 110 head that August, at a loss of about $60 a head against what he had into them, and the rest he could barely keep fed. Gus, in the same months, lost not one ewe to the drought and weaned a lamb crop, only slightly smaller than a wet year, on grass he had never irrigated and grain he had never bought. One flock that could not eat the country it stood on, breaking. One flock bred to eat exactly that country holding. The contrast was no longer a matter of opinion. It was 2 columns of numbers, and the drought had written both. Reese, who was now a senior grader at the plant, saw it from the receiving dock. He watched the commercial flocks come in light and stressed all that summer. Watched the carcass weights fall, and the prices with them. And one afternoon in late July, with a hauler asking him why the numbers had fallen off a cliff, he stood there with his clipboard and called the whole season an anomaly, a 100-year event, the kind of thing the model was never built to price and could not be blamed for missing. A boutique problem, he said, almost to himself, a tail risk nobody could have planned for. It was the 3rd time a version of that word had been used in this story to make a failure sound like bad. Luck and Reese believed it completely. because believing it was easier than the alternative. The alternative was that the model had measured the wrong things all along, that the tail risk was the whole point, that the lean, odd flock browsing cedar 20 miles away had been pricing this exact summer correctly for 100 years. Dale held on into the fall of 2022, the way good men do, longer than was wise, because admitting it was over meant admitting the experts had been wrong. And he had bet his grandfather's land on them. By October, the creek was a line of cracked mud. The grain bill had eaten the last of the operating loan, and the bank had begun the quiet, polite, devastating conversations that precede a sale. He came to Gus's fence one cold morning, and he did not lean on it easy the way he used to. He stood with his hands in his pockets, and he could not finish his sentences. He said he had done everything He said the numbers all. He had the look of a man who has been doing arithmetic in his head at 3 in the morning for a month and keeps arriving at the same answer. He looked out at the lean churro ewes, browsing cedar on a brown hillside, fat and calm, and bred down through 100 dry years. For exactly this, and the man who had pitied that flock for 20 years could not say the rest of what he meant. Gus did not make him say it. He told Dale to come up to the house, and he put coffee on, and the two old men sat at the kitchen table, where the journal lay, and Gus did the only generous thing a quiet man knows how to do, which was to start talking about what came next, instead of what had failed. That winter, Gus did 3 things, and none of them was gloat. He bought 40 acres of Dale's grass at a fair price, not a bargain, so Dale could pay the bank and keep his house. He took Dale's 12 best surviving ewes, the dozen that had somehow held condition, and bred them into the churro flock to widen its blood. And he asked Dale to come learn the smokehouse, because the standing order from Houston had grown past what one old man and his granddaughter could fill, and Gus needed hands he trusted. Dale, 63 years old and newly humbled, learned to salt a leg by the days per pound rule, written in another man's journal, weighing each one and turning it on the schedule and pressing his thumb to the muscle the way Gus showed him. And something in him that the drought had broken began, slowly, to mend. Which brings us back to that day in the spring of 2023, and to the number. Ada's kitchen had become 3 kitchens, hers and 2 more in Houston and 1 in Dallas, all of them serving thin, dark slices of Gus Bauer's cold-smoked churro mutton, ham to people who had no idea what a carcass grid was and would not have cared. Ada drove out herself to put the new arrangement on paper, and she sat at the kitchen table, where Nell had once done the math that said, "Sell the flock," and she slid a single sheet across the wood. It was a standing annual order, every leg the farm could cure, at a price per pound set by her and not negotiated. The number on the sheet for 1 year, for the entire smoked output of a small flock the packing plant had refused to weigh at any price, was $410,000. Gus read it once. Then he read it again, the way his grandfather had taught him to read anything that mattered slowly, to be sure. He set the sheet down on the table. He did not say a word. Nell, standing at the counter, felt the number land in the room, with a weight far past the digits on the page, because 4 years earlier the same animals had been worth less than the diesel it took to haul them, and the only thing that had changed was that someone qualified to judge had finally been asked the right question. Outside the window, the old smokehouse stood black and squat against the evening, holding what it had always held. Biscuit, the gray sheepdog who had lain at Gus's boots through every one of these years, lifted her head at the silence and then put it down again. The quiet in the kitchen held for a long time. No one filled it. Reese came out to the farm that summer, and this is the part I want to tell carefully, because the niche of this story does not punish the confident man. It corrects him. He did not come as a grader. He came on his own time, in his own truck, with the printed carcass sheet from 2019 folded in his pocket, the same one he had handed Gus, kept all these years, for a reason he could not have named until now. He had heard the way people in a county hear things, where Gus Bauer's lambs were going, and what they were bringing, and the number had done something to the clean confidence that had carried him since school. He stood in the smokehouse and looked up at the hanging legs and the soot of 100 years, and he asked Gus a question instead of answering one. He asked how the old man had known. Gus did not lecture him. He took down the journal, opened it to the 1951 page, and let Reese read the words they hunt their living in another man's hand. Reese stood there a while, turning the laminated grid card over in his fingers. The card he had built his certainty on, and it looked very small in that room. Then he asked, quietly, whether he could come back and learn how the cure worked, because there was nothing in his training that explained any of it, and he wanted, for the first time in his professional life, to understand a thing the grid could not measure. Gus told him the smokehouse door was not locked. It was the closest the old man came, in the whole of this story, to saying he had been right. The method spread the way good methods do, slowly and by hand. Nell took the journal and did the thing her grandfather never would have, which was to formalize it, writing each step down in clean modern language beside the old slanting hand. Days per pound, and smokehouse temperatures, and the rule about which lambs to choose, so the knowledge would survive past the people who carried it. She kept the old leather notebook open beside her new one as she worked, and she was careful to copy not just the numbers, but the reasons, because she had learned that a number without its reason is the thing the carcass grid had been all along. 4 neighbors, who had run commercial flocks and been hammered by the drought, came, one at a time, to ask about the breed that had walked through it. There was a young couple east of town who had lost most of a flock, and nearly the place with it, and an old rancher named Pruitt, who had sworn for 30 years that the churro were goats with delusions, and now stood at the fence with his hat in his hand. Gus sold them breeding stock at a price they could afford, a few $100s a head when he could have asked far more, and he taught them for nothing what the journals said about hunting a living off rough ground. He did not tell them they had been wrong. He let the lambs and the dry years to come do that the way the drought had done it for him. Dale ran the smokehouse now most days, and he was good at it, better than he had any right to expect, because 40 years of working with his hands had given him a thumb that learned the firmness of a curing leg faster than Nell's had. He told anyone who asked that the worst year of his life had turned out to be the year he finally learned what his neighbor had known all along. And he said it without bitterness, which is the rarest thing a humbled man can manage. Gus did not get big. That was the part the advisors could never have predicted, because their whole model assumed that anyone who could scale would. He capped the flock at the number the land could carry. In a dry year, never the number a wet year tempted him toward, and he refused the investors who started calling once the Houston tables made the farm a story. He paid off the small note on Dale's 40 acres. He set Nell up with a formalized journal and a third of the operation in her name. He kept making mutton ham by hand in a stone building, older than the state's modern idea of farming, and he priced it so the people who made it were paid like the craftsmen they were. Here is what I have come to believe. Walking that ground and reading that journal and standing in the cool dark of that smokehouse. There are 2 kinds of knowledge in this world, and they are not enemies, though we are forever setting them against each other. One kind is wide and fast and confident, and it can feed a nation, and it measures everything it can count. and quietly decides that what it cannot count does not exist. The other kind is narrow and slow and patient, and it lives in one person's hands and one family's journal and one piece of stubborn ground. And it knows the things the first kind cannot see, the value of a lean lamb that hunts its own living, the worth of a flavor that takes 3 walls and 4 months to build, the difference between an animal that survives and an animal that merely gains. A grading sheet is not wrong about what it measures. It is only wrong when it believes that what it measures is all there is. What is rigid breaks, and what is adaptive endures. The drought did not read the carcass grid. The chef did not eat the spreadsheet. And the lamb that the slaughterhouse would not weigh, the boutique liability, the museum piece, the worthless thing, turned out to be the only part of the whole enterprise that could not be replaced by anyone with a loan and a feed truck, because it could not be bought, only kept, and only by someone willing to watch one piece of ground for a very long time. The smokehouse still stands behind the barn, black inside, cool in the worst heat, holding legs of dark meat that will feed tables Gus Bauer will never see. The journal sits on the kitchen table under a single lamp, 2 old hands and 1 young one in it now. And on most evenings, when the work is done and the light goes long across the brown hills that fed his flock, through the year the rain stopped, the old man sits on the porch with the gray dog at his boots. And he does not think of himself as a wealthy man, though by any honest accounting he has become one. He thinks of his grandfather and of 3 cloth-tied bundles of fleece carried into these hills a long time ago by a man who knew what they were for. True wealth was never the number on the sheet. It was the thing the sheet could not measure, kept alive by hand until the world remembered it was hungry for it.